Hello, thank you for having me this afternoon. So again, I would just like to say thank you for the warm welcome and thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. It's always an honor and always a pleasure to have these type of opportunities to share our work, especially in a small group like this. I find it really exciting and I hope it draws some good discussion. I would like to just take a quick moment and honor and recognize Dr. George Foxcroft. As mentioned, George passed away in the beginning of December, and he was a good friend and my mentor. He spent quite a bit of time working on this presentation prior to his passing. So this presentation is a combination of both our thoughts, and I hope we can honor him well tonight. I think often in the presentations, we leave the acknowledgements to the end, but I think it's really important to acknowledge these type of things because it really supports the work we do. As mentioned, I work at Livestock Gentech at the University of Alberta. I have the honor and pleasure of working with several different industry partners, as my position at the U of A is industry funded. We have a good support or some large projects from the pork checkoff program in the United States and work with PIC as well. PigGen Canada supports Livestock Gentech and supported by the companies shown here. These are the faces of Livestock Gentech. It's a leading Alberta organization for livestock genetics and genomics research. And we're focusing a lot on beef and on the swine side. And we're really trying to grow our knowledge transfer activities as well. So with that, this is the outline of what I'll cover today. I'll talk about litter of origin as a key component of efficient pork production systems. Specifically talking about low individual birth weight and sow birth weight phenotype. I will talk about these two factors in relation to the efficiency of the gilt replacement program and sow lifetime productivity. I hope some of the things we discussed today address the question of the meeting, are your sows meeting their reproductive potential? So we know that genetic selection for litter size has increased the number of low birth weight pigs. And we also know that low birth weight offspring are a major concern for the swine industry and have several detriment causes, such as unrenting, increases in prewean mortality, negative effects on growth rate, carcass quality, and reproductive potential. What I'll show you throughout this presentation is that these detrimental effects of low birth weight are not only restricted to small pigs within the litter, but extend to the entire litters. And this is what we define as litter phenotype. So the first question we're going to ask and hopefully try to answer is, where do low birth weight pigs come from? And there's two sources of low birth weight pigs. The first one is within litter variation, and this is looking at individual birth weights. So on this figure, we have 6 different sows. Each point within that sow represents a weight of an individual pig within that litter. On paper, these sows are exactly the same. They have an average total born of 14 and an average litter birth weight of 1.4 kilograms. However, in reality, these litters are very different, both in the variation around the mean and the number or the percentage of pigs that fall below 1 kilogram, which is shown to be a risk factor for future development. Second source of low birth weight pigs is due to between litter variation, and this is we refer to this litter birth weight phenotype. Again, here we have 6 different sows with an average total born of 14, but as you can see here, the composition of these litters are very different. We can classify these sows as having these sows here as having the low birth weight phenotype. They have an average litter birth weight of less than 0.9 kilograms. And these sows here have the high birth weight phenotype, and they have an average litter birth weight of about 1.9 kilograms. The challenges, what we're concerned about, is that these low birth weight sows have entire litters of low birth weight pigs. So over the next series of slides, we're going to talk about the first source of low birth weight pigs being within litter variation, and we're going to discuss some of the postnatal development in pigs, as we highlighted before. So this figure shows the effect of piglet birth weight on pre-weaning mortality. As we can see here, it's a summary of several different studies, but as on the horizontal axis, we have birth weight, and on the vertical axis, we have pre-weaning mortality. It's easy to see as we increase in birth weight, we have a decrease in pre-weaning mortality. And these authors suggest that those pigs with a birth weight of less than 1.1 kilograms had an increase in pre-weaning mortality as shown here, about nearly 35%. And out of all the pigs measured, only 15% of these pigs had birth weights less than this risk factor of 1.1 kilograms. However, they represented 43% of total pre-weaning mortalities. So this really highlights the negative effects of having those low birth weight pigs and how much they can contribute to pre-weaning mortality. The next three slides are work that was completed in collaboration with the University of Alberta and Dr. Almeida's group in Brazil. What they did is they looked at within variation in birth weight on male pigs. They classified these pigs as either having the low individual birth weight or high birth weight. And then they looked at several different carcass and growth characteristics. As shown here, one of the first factors they looked at was muscle fiber size and number, and the effect on postnatal performance. Again, gilts or boars were classified as even having the high birth weight or low birth weight, and this was measured at either birth or at 150 days of age. So you can notice some very drastic differences between the high and low birth weight pigs. These higher numbers of smaller muscle fibers in these high birth weight pigs will be linked to greater lean growth potential and higher lean yield. Similarly, this slide shows the effect of birth weight on duodenal mucosal height, as shown here. And again, I think it's very evident to see that these low birth weight pigs, both at birth and 150 days of age, had lower height of the duodenal mucosal. And this reflects the immaturity of small intestine that may enhance the risks of developing intestinal diseases and reduce digestive capacity. And overall, this explains some of the variation that we may see in growth rate and carcass characteristics. As mentioned, there's a negative effects on birth weight on reproductive potential in gilts. Gilts with a birth weight of less than a kilogram have compromised survival and growth, and it negatively influences piglet production and longevity. So those gilts with a birth weight of less than a kilogram are culled earlier from the herd, and they produce fewer pigs during their lifetime. Birth weight also influences negative reproductive efficiency as well, and this leads to poor reproductive performance. And Dr. Billy Flowers has even suggested that those gilts with a birth weight of less than 1.1 kilograms simply do not have the reproductive machinery or potential to be efficient reproductively, no matter how well they're managed later in their lives. So this is just a brief overview, but it really does show that low individual birth weight do have a lot of negative effects at the production level. We see across the literature, the data is very conclusive that low birth weight pigs have a negative effect on growth performance, carcass traits, increased mortality rates, and reduced reproductive potential. And it's still an area of great research, and there's some different types of research even showing that low birth weight pigs have different cognitive abilities as well. So when we look at how to manage these low birth weight pigs, there are some management and postnatal interventions that we can implement in these high risk low birth weight pigs. Two factors are colostrum intake and day one care or managing thermoregulation. Colostrum intake is very important. This work is from Dr. Bortolos's group in Brazil. And what they looked at is the probability of death until about 42 days of age, according to colostrum intake and based on birth weight of piglets. So in this figure, what we see is on the horizontal axis, we have colostrum intake. And then pigs are classified as either having the low birth weight, intermediate birth weight, or high birth weight. So it's very evident to see that these low birth weight pigs without adequate colostrum injection have a high probability of death within 42 days after birth. And we can see in all cases, if all pigs consume adequate amounts of colostrum, the relative amount of death or mortality is relatively the same. These authors conclude that colostrum intake and birth weight are important for the survival and growth of suckling piglets, and the low birth weight and intermediate birth weight piglets are more dependent on colostrum intake than the high birth weight pigs to ensure their survival. Two other strategies that we can implement, and this is more on the reproductive side. We can implement strategic cross-fostering of replacement females, and we'll talk about this in the next slide. And we could also recommend that the non-selection of these low birth weight gilts, so any gilts that are less than a kilogram at birth, you might want to consider non-selecting them so they actually never become a potential replacement female. So strategic cross-fostering is work by Dr. Billy Flowers, and this is where you reduce the litter size in which the replacement gilts are raised. In his latest study here, gilts are either raised in litters of 15.8 or 12.9 during lactation. We can see that reducing the litter size had significantly positive effects on sow longevity. It improved farrowing rate, and it tended to increase number of pigs born over 6 parities. So if we think of overall retention rate, there's probably about a 20% difference, and this is very significant when considering replacement rates in our herds. So the next thing we're going to look at is I'm going to provide some evidence for the low birth weight phenotype in our herds. So this slide shows the correlation between litter size and average litter birth weight as shown here. So total born is on the horizontal axis and the average litter birth weight is on the vertical axis. So as we can see, it's a negative relationship. As we increase in total born, we have a decrease in the average litter birth weight. What we also notice here that the correlation isn't very strong. So although the differences in average litter birth weight, some of it is due to total born, there's a lot of that variation is due to other factors. When we look at this type of data, we tend to disregard litters of less than 10. Litters of less than 10, there may be other factors contributing in this, such as maybe perhaps a poor breeding management, or there might be temperature, semen temperature, and poor feed during lactation. All may contribute to these lower than abnormal litter sizes. On the opposite end, we have the most prolific sows, as shown here. So due to uterine capacity, they tend to have lower average litter birth weights in any case. So the litter sizes that we are interested in are shown here. They're highlighted in this box here, and they range from about 10 to 19. So if we look at the variation in average litter birth weight at these litters between about 10 and 16 as shown here, we can actually see there's actually very little difference in very little correlation here. So those litters that have a total born of 9 compared to 16, there's only a couple hundred grams difference in average litter birth weight. So this really confirms that litter size in these mid-range litter sizes is not the contributing factor to the differences in average litter birth weight. What we are more concerned about, and what we talked about before is that between litter variation. So if we look here, there's about a 2 kilogram difference in these average litter birth weights. And that's what's of interest that we're looking at here. So looking at some of these characteristics of these most prolific sows that we have highlighted here, when we put the population average on this graph of 1.37 kilograms, what we see is these most prolific sows always tend to have an average litter birth weight of below the population average. Also, what we also can see here is that there's an increasing lack of high birth weight pigs due to those most prolific sows. So what we want to introduce here is the concept again of the low birth weight litter phenotype. So what we want to do is look at the bottom 15% of all litters as shown here. And we can see that irrespective of total born, we have many sows that display the extreme birth weight phenotype as shown here. And this is what we are concerned about within our industry. Another consideration for this birth weight phenotype is that it's a repeatable trait. So on this graph, this work is from Dr. Egbert Knoll. Again, different data set, but showing the exact same relationships. But what he's highlighted here is 2 different sows over their productive life. So for example, here, this is one sow and had 7 different litters, and every litter in her productive life, she had a low average litter birth weight. So this is another concern that this low birth weight phenotype is repeatable over the sow's life. So what are the causes of the low birth weight phenotype? It's the interaction between genotype and phenotype and the interaction of these component traits. Those factors that affect litter size, such as ovulation rate and embryonic and fetal survival, and those factors that affect more litter quality, such as uterine capacity and placenta function. So the first one, we're looking at high ovulation rates and how this affects or contributes to the low birth weight phenotype. Here, it's a very small set of sows, but what we did here is classify sows based on their average litter birth weight over multiple parities. These sows were classified as having the high birth weight phenotype if they had litters above 1 standard deviation above the mean, as shown here. And these sows were classified as low over the productive life if they had litters that were less than 1 minus 1, they're nearly 1 standard deviation from the mean. What we can see here, and it confirms what we were just talking about, there was actually no difference in over litter size, as shown here. But as we can see here, there's quite a big difference in the average litter birth weight as expected, about 1.5 kilograms compared to 1 kilogram. What we show here is that one of the largest differences, again, between these two phenotypes is ovulation rate, 21 to 26. So at least this population of sows, ovulation rate is probably one of the driving factors of this phenotype. The second contributing factor to low birth weight phenotype pigs is intrauterine crowding in early gestation. So again, this is a study that we completed quite some time ago now, but what we did is we had the opportunity during a depopulation to breed gilts or sows and either collect their uteruses at day 30 or day 50 of gestation as shown here. So when you look at this, at day 30 of gestation, this is the resulting number of embryos in utero. As we can see, it ranges from about 6 all the way to 28. However, at day 50 of gestation, we can see a different distribution occurs, ranging from about 4 to 18. What we can see here is that there's entire population or range of embryos that were present at day 30 that are no longer present at day 50. And this is due to the intrauterine crowding and death and loss of these embryos. The challenge is these litters were crowded at day 30 of gestation. And although these embryos have died, the remaining embryos in these crowded embryo or gestations at day 30 are going to have compromised placenta weights throughout their gestation. So the next cause of low birth weight pigs is limited placenta development, as shown here. This work is from Dr. Miranda Smith within our group, and she looked at the relation between litter average birth weight, as shown on the horizontal axis here, and average placenta weight on the vertical axis. As you can see, it's a positive relationship. As we increase in average litter birth weight, we have an increase in placenta weight. So what we notice here, again, the same story is shown here. Those pigs with a low average birth weight have a lower placenta weight compared to those sows with a high average birth weight have a higher average placenta weights. More recently, Julia Morani from Dr. Michael Dick's group looked at the effect of birth weight phenotype on placenta development. What she showed here, sows were classified as either having the low birth weight phenotype or the high birth weight phenotype, as we discussed before, and we can see the significant differences in overall placenta volume at day 30 of gestation. When we look at the relationship between placenta volume and embryo weight, as we discussed before, there's a very significant difference. So those sows with a higher placenta volume also have higher embryonic weight. So what we can assume or predict from these results is that placenta function is really one of the drivers of the low birth weight phenotype. Furthermore, what she's concluded, as shown here, this is one of the examples that we can see that there's a lot of crowding at day 30 of gestation. If we look closely here, there's two placentas that are overlapping, and this becomes part of the problem. It's the limited uterine capacity that's ultimately driving this. So out of Julia's work, when we're looking at the causes of the low birth weight phenotype sows, it's really a decrease in uterine capacity or limited uterine capacity, leading to poor placenta function. And this really is what drives impaired prenatal development. So one of the problem of these low birth weight pigs is that it is a result of intrauterine growth retardation. And I think this graph is really good to show the effect of the brain sparring effects. So again, this work is from Dr. Miranda Smith. She looked at the relationship in stillborn pigs. She dissected them and looked at the relationship between individual birth weight and tissue weight, looking at the brain, muscle, small intestine, and liver. And I think this is really evident to show the brain sparring effect. We can see that the brain is largely conserved no matter what the body weight of these pigs are. But we can see here that the tissues such as muscle, small intestine, and liver do increase with increasing body weight. So what is a good measure of intrauterine retardation is the brain to liver ratio as shown here. We've all seen within the production systems the characteristic look of pigs that are subject to IUGR. These ones with a birth weight of less than 1.05 kilograms, you can see the dome dolphin-like head and the typical kind of skinny body. And the mild effect of intrauterine growth retardation is shown here. And as we see, the normal looking pig. So it's the higher brain to liver rate ratio in these low birth weight pigs that is really characteristic of IUGR, and this does have permanent negative effects on the body structure, physiology, and metabolism. So coming back to the causes of the low birth weight phenotype, our hypothesis is that the extreme low birth weight phenotype is the result of poor placenta development, and this is driven by extreme intrauterine crowding of embryos early in gestation. And unfortunately, within the genetic companies, these traits, or the interaction of these traits, they're hard to measure, and they're not really responsive to current selection practices. So we have to manage this phenotype in different ways. So in summary, when we're looking at the low birth weight phenotype, pigs born to sows with the low birth weight phenotype, we have to remember, carry all the same risks for individual low birth weight, but as a litter trait. So all pigs within this litter are going to have a negative effect on the growth rates, the carcass quality, the pre-weaning mortality, and the reproductive potential. The other challenge is that this trait is repeatable over consecutive parities. And unfortunately, it's also a transgenerational trait. So this trait is passed down from the dam to the progeny. As we reviewed also, a low birth weight phenotype negatively affects birth weight, body composition, postnatal survival, and growth performance of terminal line offspring. And this is independent of the size of the litter born. So why are we interested in litter of origin in the context of gilt replacement management and sow lifetime productivity? So again, the low birth weight phenotype is a result of these component traits. And what we really want to discuss next is how it has a negative effect on the productivity of the low birth weight phenotype sow and the resulting replacement females that she produces. It has a negative effect on the efficiency of the gilt development unit and future sow lifetime productivity of the replacement females produced. As mentioned, on the sow level, the average litter birth weight phenotype is a repeatable trait. So what we did is we classified sows as having either the low birth weight phenotype or the high birth weight phenotype. And what we can see when we measure them over four parities, no sow first giving birth to a low average birth weight litter produced a high birth weight litter at the next farrowing. And this is good because this allows us the opportunity to make management decisions about these sows. And if we recommend to call these low birth weight phenotype sows, you have very little risk of her being a more productive sow later in life. As we expect, and as we've talked about before, even though these sows are classified by high and low birth weight phenotype, although there is some relationship to the average litter size, there is a lot of variation. So this isn't driven by overall litter size. We also recently completed a study looking at the interaction between the sow birth weight phenotype. So sows are classified as low, medium, or high birth weight phenotype, and the interaction with individual birth weight. And I think this is really important interactions to look at. As expected, and we've shown similar slides earlier in the presentation, if we look at the relationship between individual birth weight and the probability of losses until day 4 gestation, we can see that those birth gilts with a birth weight of less than 1.18 kilograms had an increased probability of loss within 4 days of birth. And we feel that these losses are likely due to early crushing and poor weaning survival. So again, it's really highlighting the need for a good post-farrowing care for day 1 care and colostrum management. And again, implementing some of those strategies we talked about earlier, the strategic cross-fostering of replacement females. If we reduce the size of the lactating litter in your gilt replacement gilt females, you'll have a much better chance of them having a longer productive life. This graph again looks at selection efficiency, but up until the point of pre-selection. So when gilts enter the gilt pool about 160 days of age, and as you can see here, again, a low individual birth rate increases the probability of mortality and loss, as shown here. So those gilts that we highlighted before as being the risk factor of less than a kilogram, you can see in some cases 80% of them are already non-selected by the time that they enter the gilt pool. Excuse me. It's really interesting here. If we look at, we had a positive or significant interaction between litter birth weight phenotype, so the sow birth weight phenotype and individual birth weight. If we notice here, those gilts that were born to sows with the high birth weight phenotype and had an individual birth weight of greater than 1.5 kilograms had an increased probability of loss compared to the other two phenotypes. So this is almost different than we would expect. I think one of the reasons for this is the increased growth rates of these females during their productive life. And what the problem is that on these farms, we recommend that gilts be bred between about 135 to 160 kilograms body weight. So these gilts have increased growth rates are already exceeding those. So at the opposite end of the spectrum, that these high birth weight phenotypes are also becoming a problem later in life. This relationship shows what we were just talking about, the relationship of the growth proponents. So the interaction of individual birth weight and sow birth weight phenotype on growth rate at pre-selection. As we can see and as we expect, growth rate has individual birth weight has a negative effect on growth rate. Those lightest gilts have a lower growth rate at pre-selection, so at 170 days of age. Apologize, I'm losing my voice. Yeah, so it is shown here. Also, there's an effect on having the low birth weight phenotype. These gilts born to sows with a low birth weight phenotype and having an individual birth weight of less than a kilogram also were further compromised. So this really lends to our thinking that these gilts due to the low birth weight phenotype are different from the other phenotypic classifications. And they are probably subjected to IUGR as we've highlighted before. Another important factor in gilt management and in the efficiency of gilt management is looking at the responses to puberty induction in the gilt development unit. As shown here, we looked at the relationship between individual birth weight and the probability of being in estrus or having a detected estrus within 21 days of the start of puberty stimulation at about 180 days of age. As we can see here, individual birth weight affected the response to puberty induction stimuli. So those gilts with an individual birth weight of less than 1.2 kilograms were slower to respond to the bores, slower to come into puberty, and were less efficient than those heavier birth weight gilts. And when puberty is delayed due to these low birth weight and slower growing gilts, it's going to have a negative effect on the efficiency of your gilt development unit. Our area of expertise and what we really strongly believe in is gilt management. So I can't go without doing a couple slides on good gilt management because it's such a key factor to managing these low birth weight gilts. We have to make sure that we have good gilt management programs in place. So we have good selection procedures to make sure we're only adding good select gilts to the gilt development unit. This is one slide, and this is an entirely another presentation in itself. But briefly, we want to make sure in any gilt development unit that we have the good stimulation programs in place. We want gilts in heat by 28 to about 35 days. We want to make sure that gilts are used direct contact, full direct contact with gilts, not just a fence line contact, because when we have gilts with full direct contact, about 20% more come into heat within 4 weeks, so it's far more efficient. I can't emphasize enough the importance of good record keeping to be able to manage and measure what your performance of the gilt pool. And our ultimate goal is to look at these key components for gilt eligibility. So for every gilt bred that enters your sow herd, we want them to have an early puberty. We want to start birth stimulation early enough, so about 170 days of age. We want gilts bred on at least second estrus at 135 days of age and prior to 230 days of age. I'm sorry, I realized I have this all mixed up here. So once we get gilts into the herd, by a good gilt development program, meeting those targets we set out, what we saw is that litter size over 3 parities was largely unaffected by the sow birth weight phenotype. Once we get these sows, low birth weight pigs into production, they had similar litter sizes over 3 different parities. Interestingly, as we've kind of highlighted before, what became the problem is with these higher birth weight sows, they did have a tendency to have an increased stillborn. This is not surprising because gilts that are heavier breeding, there is a tendency for them to have an increase in stillborns. And also these higher birth weight sows actually had a lower litter size at parity too. And again, this probably is not surprising. These sows, these gilts that have high individual birth weights are probably bred overweight. So this is not surprising that they do maybe have some problems at rebreeding after their first litter, which would account for some of these differences. Also, very interestingly, I guess a really important part of sow lifetime productivity is looking at retention rate in the breeding herd. We looked at overall retention rate of the low, medium, and high birth weight sows, gilts born to these high birth weight sows, from gilt service all the way to fairing to fourth parity. Our target, and then generally accepted across the industry, is that we'd like to see all females served, about 70% may reach to third parity. But you can see selection rates in general are fairly good. Both the low and medium birth weight gilts born to low and medium birth weight phenotype sows met this target. And even the high birth weight phenotype sows met the target with just over that target. What we can see if we look further to about fourth parity, there is a trend for higher attrition of gilts born to sows with the high birth weight phenotype. So again, a bit surprisingly is that these high birth weight phenotype sows have more of a negative effect on sow lifetime productivity. So again, coming back to this overall figure that we talked about, we just talked about some of those negative effects on both the productivity of the sow and the negative effect on the gilt development efficiency and the sow lifetime productivity. And again, the next thing we want to talk about quite briefly is some management and postnatal interventions. And what I really want to emphasize is a lot of those management and postnatal interventions we talked about for the low birth weight pig is what we can apply to these sow birth weight phenotypes. So ultimately, our goal is to improve lifetime efficiency at the number of levels. And we have to remember that our goal is to improve efficiency and ultimately the total number of quality pigs weaned during the productive lifetime of a female. So at the production nucleus and multiplication level, we'd like to see early culling of sows that repeat the low birth weight phenotype. And we have to remember this is only about 10% of the total sow population. We want to manage lower birth weight gilts and lactation. We achieve this by measuring individual birth weights and sow birth weight phenotypes, implementing minimum birth requirements at both the pig and sow level. And we want to raise these lower birth weight gilts in smaller litters. The outcomes really improves your efficiency. It has increased efficiency of the genetic transfer program, improved retention rate of gilts throughout the gilt development unit. You'll have more select gilts with higher potential for sow lifetime productivity produced per sow bred, and you have an increase in the number of quality pigs weaned during the productive lifetime of the female. Just a quick overview of how we see this put in place on farms. We can see here, these are the maternal line sows over her 5 parities. We'd like to measure the average litter birth weight on parity 1 and parity 2 females. If she repeats twice, she's a voluntary call, because we have to remember it's a transgenerational effect. We want to not tag those gilts with a birth weight of less than 1 kilogram. Keep in mind, strategic cross-fostering of those medium and low litters is also important. Of course, good gilt management throughout the productive lifetime is important. So once they become sows, what we essentially want to do is hopefully remove that phenotype from the herd. As these sows start to be used for more commercial breedings, we can see here, because the low birth weight phenotype sows are removed at this level, we assume that they're out of the population now, and we assume in the commercial line progeny that produced, we'll see an overall decrease in the percentage of low birth weight litters, and hopefully have a positive effect on factors such as pre-weaning mortality rate and growth. So with that, again, that's the conclusion